Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Blackburn. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Manager of the Dwelling Doctor. I'm also the Chair and host of AWAB's Council, the big banner that you see at the back. When I was writing this presentation, I was reminded, as it's Cheltenham Week, of the one horse that I ever backed that won the Grand National, which was called Comply or Die, 2008. And I'd like to thank Russell for letting us speak today. Russell, I think, summed it up really well early today. We talked about AWAB's law, he talked about looking in the rear-view mirror. Now, AWAB's law went live 134 days ago. I'm sure we've had a lot of sleepless nights since, both in the run-up to it and since it went live. So today I want to give a bit of an insight into what we think going beyond compliance means. But I'm going to start with telling you a story. I hope probably that this is something that many of you will recognise. The tenant calls to report the mould in the house and goes through a call script and a triage process. A housing officer receives a form detailing the tenant's report of mould in a child's bedroom. The contractor attends, the walls are cleaned, anti-mould paint is applied, the case is closed. 6 months later, the mould comes back. Another visit is scheduled, the same treatment happens again, the property is repainted, advice leaflets are given about opening windows and using the heating more efficiently. They sit behind the pizza leaflets on top of the fire. Another winter passes, the mould returns. For the organisation, this becomes a repairs issue or an avoid disrepair issue. For the contractor, it becomes a repeat job, a survey and the treatment per square metre fee. But for the family living in that home, it becomes something very different. The child sleeping in that room develops a persistent but niggly cough. The parents start to worry about their health. They begin to feel that nobody is really listening to them. I think some of the previous speakers made some excellent points about that in terms of trust. That trust in the landlord starts to break down. Eventually, the case escalates, sometimes to a complaint, sometimes to a moan on Facebook, sometimes to the Ombudsman, sometimes to the local media. And when that happens, the question is rarely, did the organisation comply with procedure? The question becomes, did the organisation actually solve the problem? This is the difference between compliance and outcomes. And it's why today I want to talk about what it means to go beyond compliance, delivering safe, damp and mould solutions that are defensible and build trust. Okay? I think it was covered up before by Gary, who talked about ability, integrity and benevolence when it comes to trust. So, look at what we have on the screen. Compliance in mould management. I think compliance should be the floor and not the ceiling. I think for too many organisations, we think compliance, we tick the box, we got out to those AWAB's law timescales, we got the job, we responded within 24 hours and we made it safe. It was a significant job, we got there within 5 days, we ticked the box. The tenant filled in a questionnaire, everyone's happy, job ticks, the chief exec's got that KPI, we're not going to go to prison this week, okay? But for me, that's not enough. As was mentioned before, according to the regulator, repairs now cost the industry £10 billion a year. That's 42% higher than it was pre-pandemic. Okay? The balance is now around 70% reactive, 30% preventative. That just seems wrong to me. And it's not as if we're short of legislation. We're one of the most heavily regulated sectors out there. We've got AWAB's law, or the Social Housing Regulation 2023 Act. We've got the Decent Homes Standard. We've got the EPC regulations. We've got similar regulations in Wales and Scotland. So we're massively regulated, but yet we still occasionally get it wrong. So we can meet the regulatory requirements. We probably all know the time frames. We're sending out our written summaries within 3 days. We've got the long stop of 12 weeks to those preventive works. We're meeting all those little elements, but I still don't think it's enough. Okay? We can meet those minimum standards. We can show compliance, but are we actually delivering good outcomes for residents? So, this is the reality on the ground. So I work for a company called the Dwelling Doctors. We work across a number of organisations. I won't tell you which organisation this is, but this was a property that came through to us as a significant job. So they've gone through the triaging and decided this could be treated within 5 days. If you look at that top left picture, you can see literally moisture glistening off the walls. You can see mould literally growing around the bed frame. Okay? That is an emergency 100%. Everything that we were supposed to be deemed as an emergency when the legislation came into being. Okay? We dealt with this within 24 hours. As you'll see at the bottom, the images are time-stamped and geolocated stamped. That's the sort of compliance evidence that we're talking about. And this is the reality of what we're dealing with every day. This client in question sent us 30 emergency jobs last week. So we know that the problems are there and very much real. Okay, so I thought I'd do something a bit different today. Obviously, I appreciate you're all probably ready for your kit. You've all had a bit of cake. So I thought we'd do a bit of audience participation. There was no interpretive dance. So if you'd like to get your phones out, we'll do a bit of Slido. Hopefully you've used this before. Scan the code on the screen, or go to slido.com and put in the code. The bit you should all see a black screen with a Q&A and 2 heads on it until I press the next button. Some of you are reading your WhatsApps, some are checking the BBC Sport website. It's okay, it's all good. Okay, hopefully your phones will change now. So what is your biggest challenge in terms of damp and mould management? Okay, I think that's really interesting that diagnosis of root cause has come top. And then all the other 5 options are broadly consistent, but diagnosis of root cause remain consistent throughout. I think that explains the problem. I think it's diagnosis of root cause. I think that comes from a lack of tenant education, but also a lack of almost the exact scenario we're talking about with regards to AI, you know, and there are AI tools that we've seen. You can take a picture of a mouldy wall, it'll say if it's mould, if it's damp, if it's condensation, and what the potential solution is. So those solutions are out there. I think part of the problem as well when it comes to tenant education is that phone call into the call centre. How many times do we listen back to those call scripts and hear, yeah, I've got mould, how big is it? You know, we start using, it's the size of a bed, it's the size of a frying pan, it's the size of a wardrobe. You know, trying to use elements that sort of diagnose it in the right way. But also often tenants don't understand, they just know there's a problem. They know there's something black or something green or something yellow, or there's a smell quite often in the property, and they know that something wrong. We'll come back to Slido in a second, because I think this is often where we fail as a sector. And this is where I think it's really, really important. I want to talk sector-wide, not in terms of organisations. Okay? Because I think often where we get it wrong is very much as a sector. We don't look at long-term solutions. We don't look at what we're doing all year round. We don't do property health checks. In 2024, the CIH and NMF had an idea about make every contact count. Every time we go into a property, we should make it count. Every interaction with that tenant, every time, it doesn't have to be that the mould inspector goes in, could be the social worker, could be the gas safe guy. Every time they go in, they make that information count. So many organisations I speak to on a regular basis don't know the first thing about the properties that they hold. They don't know who's in there, how many dogs they've got, how many kids they've got, occupancy levels, high, low, etc. Makes a massive difference in terms of what we need to do. I actually thought HMS got it right earlier. They talked about the care standard in terms of customer excellence strategy. I think that's exactly what we should be talking about every time we go into a property. I also think we need to be doing that healthy homes check. I was at an event in the House of Lords on Monday night, and we were talking about a healthy homes MOT. You know, we all take our cars for an MOT once every year, but how many times do we actually think about our home? You know, and I mean our own, never mind the tenants that we're serving. How many times do we actually look at that as an MOT and think what we could do on an annual basis to make these homes healthier and ultimately safer? And I think this is one of those things that I see that, you know, perhaps ties into root causes. is that sort of hidden causes. So we see misdiagnosis, condensation versus penetrating versus rising damp. We still see, and it's terrible to say, it says behavioural or structural causes and why blaming the tenant backfires. We still see some of those behaviours that were ruled out a few years ago. We still see the L word. I won't say it here in case the red dot comes onto the chest. But, you know, that's really dangerous. It's the one thing in Awaab's law we've got to be so careful of. You know, according to Housing Horizons, that, you know, in terms of the UK housing stock in 2023, it said that we had the worst housing stock in Western Europe, that there's more properties living with damp than anywhere else in Western Europe. We were ranked 14th out of 16 when it came to fuel poverty. And I think a lot of these factors tie into where it is. And that root cause analysis is really, really important. What's actually going on? Because we can go in, we can treat the mould, we all know what we're doing, 2-stage, 3-stage, we can do a bit of biofogging, those sort of things. But what we're actually doing to fix the problem. And there's some solutions that I think we need to consider. So, another one back on Slido. How often do mould cases return for you guys after the works have been completed? I think probably the numbers state for themselves there, don't they? We've got frequently almost as often as sometimes, often within 12 months, which suggests a cyclical pattern, and the rarely and the unsure not measured is really down the bottom. I think that really tells a story that often when we are doing these mould treatments, are we doing the right thing, are we dealing with that root cause, or are we actually doing is complying and kicking the can down the road? So I think this ties in rather accurately to root cause thinking. Often it's one of these multiple factors, you know, which carry all together. The previous speaker talked about us having too much data. I think it was Gary. You know, actually understanding to work out what we need to be measuring, what we need to be understanding. Because often these factors all work together. You know, we produce well-insulated homes, but we don't teach tenants how to live in them. We provide new fans, new roofs, etc. You know, but we still don't teach them what to do. We put new ventilation in, but they they pull the fuse out the fan. They don't use trickle vents, etc. We're doing all the right things, but the outcomes are not correct. Okay? They still get condensation. We still get tenants living in abject fuel poverty, which is criminal in the society that we live in. But I think this is not a building or a behaviour failure, it's a system failure, because some of those root causes work together. So one of the solutions that we offer is ventilation. I know lots of other contractors do across the market, so I'm not necessarily just pitching us. But I think it's looking at that whole ventilation strategy. Mould comes from a perfect golden triangle. It's about heating, it's about condensation, and it's about ventilation. There's lots of things on there that people do, lots of things on there that people don't do or don't do correct. Ducting is probably the one that I see the most. Using flexible ducting, not rigid ducting. Using electricians to fit fan, not ventilation trained staff. So they tend to fit, frankly, not the right fan and not in the right way. And I could be probably a little bit harsh on that. They don't comply with Part F building regulations. They don't use those ventilation standards. They don't look at root cause analysis. And too often what they do is not fit for purpose. And I think looking at all of those strategies, look, not every property requires the same strategy. Different properties require different solutions. And looking at that and understanding how the ventilation works in the property is a massively important factor. So, on that, do you have a ventilation strategy in place? And do you have approved contractors in place? Okay, I think there was a lot of no's on there. Interesting that someone's in the process of developing one at the moment. I think it's one of those things where if you've not got one in place, you really need one. The ventilation strategy is right for your stock, not right for your supplier or the manufacturer of that fan, which is really important, something we see a lot of. It's also making sure that you've actually bespoke that to each of the properties. So I think there's a reference there to it not being right for every development, every property type. I think that's spot on. Just making sure you've got something that can be accurately tailored. So, what do we mean by, in effect, safe and defensive practice? Okay, a few examples there. Clear diagnosis, an intervention that's proportionate. We spoke to a housing association about 6 months ago that were talking about using legal means to gain access. Felt like a sledgehammer to crack a nut when we're talking about damp and mould. Okay, getting that photographic evidence which is logged, the right data. Communication logs. There's some great systems out there that will log all of the communication that you've had with your tenants. That's got to be about big data. So that's not just the call centre log. That's the emails, that's the WhatsApp messages, as mentioned before, the text messages, the whole raft of communication, logging all of that evidence. Look at documentation is massively important. But when it comes to the Ombudsman, who we spoke to a few weeks ago on the regulator of social housing, the decision making is really, really important. Okay? Within the legislation, it talks about reasonable endeavours when it comes to AWABs. If you can demonstrate what you did and the reasons why you did it, through a triage process, through a decision tree process, I'm not saying you're going to be completely cleared, but it's going to stand you in much better stead than going, oh, we just did it on a budget basis, didn't use the right triage process. If you apply that consistently, that decision making will make a massive difference. Okay? And it's important to think about this as sort of interlocking elements because communication is low cost and high impact. If we get the communication bit right on this, in terms of managing tenant expectations, it makes a huge difference. How many times, if you look at the complaint logs that you get for a council or a housing association, it's not that we didn't do the job right. It's often down to communication. It's a misunderstanding. Or they said a morning appointment, they rocked up at 5 to 12, okay? Or they said they couldn't finish it today, they've got another job to go and do, and they didn't get a follow-up appointment, and then they just turned up without booking that in. Or the text message didn't make sense, or they didn't know my name when they rang up. They're always the usual gripes that people get because those little factors when it comes to communication, exactly as the point was raised before, we're all completely spoilt now. Amazon has completely changed the game. I saw a TV programme when I was growing up the other day. They asked you to send in a stamped addressed envelope. If I explained that to my son now, he'd burst out laughing. Now we go on Amazon, I could order anything I want in the world, it'd be delivered me by 5 o'clock tomorrow. And the bloke would tear down my drive and nearly run over my cat, but it's by the by. Yeah, these things are available to us now and we all expect them. Now if something says it's going to come in 3 days, we think, what are you doing for the other 2 days? These things are really there, and social housing and that whole system has got to adapt to that and live to those standards. So the other side of safe and defensive practice is this balance between resident frustration and trust, okay? Often, if we get this right, tenants can be frustrated. Often they're not frustrated with us, or they're frustrated, they're worried about the impacts, they're worried about what's going on. Sometimes they don't feel heard, they feel dismissed, talked down to. That's a massive problem. If we give clear explanations, we look at the realistic expectations, we look at respectful engagement, treating every house as if we're in our mum's house or our grandma's house makes a massive difference. I think that kind of ties into what the guy said today when they're working at Taurus. Going into those properties and really sort of trying to engage with them, understanding, and you know what, having a listen. They might want to have a gripe and a moan, they want to moan about all the other bits, or the fact they want a new kitchen or something else has gone wrong. It's that listening ears to make sure that our contractors listen, engage with, say, I completely appreciate that, love, I'll make a note of it, report it back to the organisation, and then go from there. Because I think if we get that right in terms of the actual experience, those human issues, those human values, we can turn it from an unhappy resident, stop it being a complaint, and certainly stopping it being an ombudsman experience. So, on behalf of my organisation, Dwelling Doctor, I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing. So, we do a lot of social value. I'm sure lots of organisations in the room do social value. And that was really compliance and ticking the box. We'd hire a few local staff. We'd spend with a few local merchants. We'd do a few school visits. We'd do a few bits and pieces that tick the box. And we didn't really feel we were making much of a difference to what was going on. So we launched a charity that's now got full charitable status called Cured, which is a charity for underheated residents brought to you by the Dwelling Doctors. And what we thought was that what we need to do is actually starting to tackle fuel poverty. Fuel poverty is if you spend more than 10% of your income on gas, electric and water. I'm sure a huge number of people in this room this either applies to or you know people that it does. Okay? And it's similar to what John talked about earlier, I think with the evidence with the Taurus Foundation in terms of what they're trying to do. So we are really tackling this through trying to make sure that we tackle that debate, looking at underheating, but also that choice, heating versus eating. It sounds glib, it's a nice little phrase you hear in the media quite a lot, but it's a reality for a lot of tenants, and looking at how we can tackle that. And landlords are seeing more repeat call visits because people can't afford to heat their homes effectively. So this is what Cured does, and I'm lucky enough to be one of the trustees of Cured. So we offer emergency energy support. So we'll send tenants £50 straight on a mobile phone card. It's got a merchant code, which means they can only spend it on gas, electric and water. Ring their provider, £50 knocks off their bill. Fully accepting that £1,100 is the average bill for a flat, £2,000 is the average bill for a house, okay? But £50 does make a difference. 99.7% of vouchers issued through this scheme are used on the same day, which makes a massive difference, okay? We're also looking at resident education. Only 1 in 10 people can use their thermostat effectively on their boilers. Makes a massive difference in terms of how you're heating. So many people, it's either off or it's on. Or there's that blast and then it's off. And that has a massive impact on mould growing in properties. Excuse me, the other thing we're looking at is innovation. We're working with a couple of smart providers. One, there's our product called Radbots, which intelligently learns when you're in the room, gives you a boost of heat just before you get up in the morning, gives you a boost of heat just before you go to bed, and something called Beanbag Heat, where it senses different elements with the room within sensors, looks to heat your home more effectively. Part of the biggest problem we see with damp and mould is that people are not heating their homes effectively. That sort of on-off situation is making a massive difference. So, I thought before we go into this bright Manchester spring afternoon, it doesn't always rain here, as you can tell, I'd give a bit of a positive note for what I think the future could be. And some of this ties into things that have already been said today. You know, I think looking at proactive property monitoring, the more of this we can do, the better. Know your stock, know your properties, know who's in them, and offer solutions that are tailored to them. We've got AI, we've got some fantastic tools, but even using Excel and using the analysis tool, you've got predictive analytics. It can give you the data that you need. It can tell you the story of the data that's there, tell you what might happen next. Most of you will have repairs logs in terms of what happened 12 months ago. You should be able to work out what's going to happen in the next 12 months. Okay? Looking at improved ventilation strategies, I think that's massive in terms of what we're doing. Housing and public health, we have a massive role to play in terms of public health. Every mould case that we prevent is a massive benefit to the NHS, to schools, to children's education. It all sort of follows down. And that greater resident engagement, not seeing residents as the problem, but seeing them as part of the solution. Okay? I think if we get that right, we can start to move from the reality of some of these slides into real practice. Now, I started with a story, and I'll finish with a quote. I believe that everyone chooses how to approach life. If you're proactive, you focus on preparing. If you're reactive, you focus on repairing. This is from John Maxwell, who was a leadership expert. He also had the 3 C's of leadership: competence, character, and connections. I think events like today really matter. We're all tied into those 3 C's in that quote. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's really, really good. Thank you. I just feel for those people that have left early and not listened to that. I think there's education there all over in terms of what you presented today, so thank you for that. And I think the polls were very interesting. Good to see we're all in similar places, I guess. We're not there out there on our own. Anyway, further ado, anybody got any questions for Chris? Come on. It's bloody AWABs and all the rest of it. You can't tell me that people haven't got questions. We've got an expert on stage here. Come on. Or is everyone still asleep? No? Anybody? Go on, Paul.
How many organisations do you find are a bit proactive, putting sensors in homes genuinely? Are they trying to do it en masse or finding good technology less used?
How many organisations have been proactive? Less than 5%. I find a lot are doing pilots, you know, so they'll have a go, they'll get some funding for 200, 300. The problem is trying to extrapolate that across their whole housing stock. So they'll maybe get switchy in or, you know, eco sensors and stuff, and they'll do it for such a small number that then to take that data and be able to confirm that across your whole stock is virtually impossible, because you've done it on a certain archetype and a certain geography. Doesn't represent the whole sort of town or borough, or for bigger organisations that wide stock. I think it's too small a number, and look, budgets are tight, you know, everyone's stretched. Finding more money for mould is a massive challenge. I think increasingly it's understanding what that model can look like, and obviously tenants have got the right to quiet enjoyment as well, which is a big part of it. So there's a lot of fear, I think, in terms of putting sensors in and people having negative experiences and pushback. So I think as long as that education piece, but at the moment it's too small a proportion of the stock, to be fair.
Chris, a question from me. I gave a presentation last year in Manchester. We did a breakfast session. One of the things that interests me, and I think push back on government, is we've been mandated to do smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. We've got the damp and mold, we've got the AWABs, but we're not mandating sensors. And I know you just described there's a mixed response, but I think there's enough technology that's been out there for long enough that we should mandate, and that would be my message to government, is just mandate sensors. The cost of that should come out of the stock condition in terms of the 30-year investment plan, because things have got to modernise. It's not about kitchens and bathrooms anymore. We know the world's changing. Just what are your thoughts around how does that message get pushed, I guess, back up to government around maybe they need to change the view of the telescope, spin it round and actually think about what can actually help rather than constantly feeling like we're being beaten, I guess, around the fact that, mentioned some of the things you said about proportionate intervention, about having all that evidence there, but there's a real opportunity here to capture that at source. Just welcome your thoughts on how we can maybe get that elevated to government at all.
I think it's using the advocates we've got within Westminster at the moment. So the event I was at on Monday night, Lord Bell spoke, who's very prominent as a crossbencher in terms of social housing. We've got a Healthy Homes APPG, which is an all-party parliamentary group. The MP for Suffolk Coastal spoke at that. Very passionate. Almost everything I've heard today, she said, in terms of that passion, that understanding, and she's a Labour MP, they're the government. I think I completely agree with you in terms of a lot of it being, I think I said before, more regulation. AWABS 2 is, 7 months off, AWABS 3 is 12 months after that. So we know there's more stuff coming down the tracks. So I think it's using that lobbying, etc., and coming together as a sector. I think I agree too often social housing is kind of a bit of a political football. It's either we're not building enough or we're not doing enough or we're not trying enough or, we're wasting money. And a lot of the organisations I work with, I don't see much waste. Quite the opposite. I see stressed inspectors going out to properties. I see people being summoned to chief execs because they were 96% on a 24-hour response time on AWABs, and I won't be the next Rochdale is the line that's used, and that's terrifying because we're all trying to do our best and we're all working all hours and stressing about it at the weekends and all the rest of it. So I think it's using that lobbying, which so many other industries do. You look at it's an animal welfare bill going through at the moment about regulating cat and dog rescues. That's come through sustained lobbying, and people in Parliament who've been in that sector are then coming into Parliament and then sort of being cases and advocates. So I'm sure if we look through the 650 MPs in Westminster and the 800 Lords, although I gather today they're bidding off the 92 hereditaries, so there's a few probably that are knocking about now, using those, finding the ones that are advocate for our case, getting that on the agenda. Is it going to be the biggest political issue? Probably not. But the more people we've got talking about it, allied to other issues, because it kind of feels like it was all about AWAB, it was all about responsiveness under the Tory government and now under Labour. So I think looking at that and looking at how we can sort of use those advocates that have got the power, and also regional mayors as well. Someone like Andy Burnham in this city, Steve Rotherham in Liverpool, Sadiq in London, there's some real power there as well with, powers that are on the fringes of what we're talking about. So there's no reason we shouldn't get them on side as well.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any questions for Chris? Yeah.
Sorry, this is Paul,
Yeah,
my
Dave.
colleague. This must be a good one.
Yeah, it is a good one. So you're a true expert on IABS. I'm just learning as I go along. So obviously it gets expanded, I think, is it October 2026? And it gets expanded into different areas, excess cold and heat, structural, fire, hygiene. How do you think that's going to impact the sector going forward?
I'm worried that it will almost be like the way that legal claims have gone now. So it was PPI 5 years ago. It's got a bit solar now, hasn't it? That sort of thing. I'm slightly concerned that mould that's had a lot of focus will sort of dip down the radar, and everyone will sort of, where attention goes, energy flows, as the saying goes. And I can see a scenario where we're all focused on mould and then we kind of forget about it because we all move on to AWABS 2 and then we move on to AWABS 3. I think that we've almost not, we've dealt with the cause, we've dealt with some of the factors with 24 hours. We've not dealt with the root cause and, some of the preventative elements. Section 7 of AWAB's law is all about preventative. I think everyone majored on those first bits, looked at the flow charts, 24 hours, got to make it, got to inspect within 10 days, got to make it safe within 5 days, written summary within 3 days, got to deal with it in 12 weeks. We all majored on those bits and forgot the other stuff that was sitting at the back with the preventive stuff. And I'm slightly worried from the conversations I'm having increasingly that people are forgetting about Section 7. I don't suggest you read it this evening, I'm sure you've all got better things to do with your time, but that's all about preventative. So I'm concerned that when this other stuff comes in that, the momentum that we got behind that will then fall away.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think reading a recent article, it said that 1 in 10 landlords were prepared for AWABs, which is quite frightening. We're seeing a 14% increase in voids because of decants now. There is significant pressure on the sector, and I know our own budgets in terms of what we're working with, in terms of answering this. And yeah, I definitely, in terms of the AWABs Council, I think it's a real positive move in terms of taking that forward, because we've got to react really, really quickly here. In terms of the situation, otherwise it is going to escalate. You're right, there'll be more and more pressure come to bear, there's no doubt in that. And you're right, there's 29 HHSRSs that are within AWABs. We've got 3, and we're going down to the next 26, aren't we? It's going to be a bloody nightmare, if I'm being honest with you. How the hell are you going to capture that at the front end? I mean, I know we capture emergencies now under RPO2 on the TSMs, but actually getting everyone sort of, I guess, up to speed is going to be a real tricky situation. It really is. And I don't know if everybody else is feeling the same, but some of this just feels, really, really difficult at this moment in time, given everything else that's going on. And just wonder where other people are in terms of this journey, and whether they feel, they're ready to start bouncing to phase 2, or is it still actually just getting through phase 1? Anybody want to share in terms of where they are? Obviously not.
I'll give you an example. An organisation I sat with 2 weeks ago, never even heard of AWABs 2. So they were well aware I was, and this is not a small organisation. This is in the teens of thousands of properties. This is not, we're not talking about a 3,000 housing association where one bloke does everything and is stressed, as repairs director and surveyor and all the rest of it. This is a big organisation that is well known nationally in the media. Trumpets a lot of positive things that they do, but then didn't know about AWABs 2. And so certainly didn't know about AWABs 3. So, when you're having those sort of conversations, and it's kind of what happened last year. We all met in Manchester at the CIH conference in June. When we were there, they launched the latest version of the guidance. They then amended it a week before the 27th of October, which was great of them, really appreciated. But, a lot of us spent a lot of time then trying to work out what that meant in practice. And too many organisations sort of got to September, came back off summer holidays and sort of said, what's this AWABs thing? And that does sort of worry me. Just to mention, Richard mentioned AWABs Council. It's a multi-sector event. We have contractors. We've got a tenant there who lived with damp and mould, whose son nearly died. We've got the Ombudsman there. We've got a lawyer there. He's one of the country's leading lawyers. It's next Tuesday in Rotherham. You're welcome to attend or sign up and come to a future event. You're more than welcome.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Okay then, final ask. Anybody want to raise anything while we've been talking there? Yeah, go on, Olivia.
Speaking about AWABS Council and keeping things simple, how is the Council going to lobby in terms of providing feedback to the regulator around the guidance and the complexity of it? Mm-hmm. Just looking at the KPIs in itself, they're so complex. So would the Council be lobbying that?
Yeah, Chris Harrison, who's speaking next week from the Ombudsman, he's very close to the regulator. We were at the NHMF conference in Stratford, which was 7 weeks ago. Although he's from the Ombudsman, very practical guy. He was talking about the fact that the judgments on damp and mould had increased 40%. That it's sort of accounting for 40% of the compensation claims that are awarded by the Ombudsman as well. And we used him as a tool in terms of explaining the reality. I think we're finding the Ombudsman a lot more practical than people think. They're not just there to be a big stick and sort of talk about maladministration and find ways of whacking people over the head. They're there to have a practical conversation, because what they're seeing, what we felt was very interesting was when he said, we don't think we're going to be punishing people for failing to meet timeframes. We're going to be failing people on process. So that a lot of organisations didn't review any damp and mould processes or complaints procedures, just went full steam ahead with a DLO or a contractor to deal with the 24 hours, etc. And where he thinks it'll fall down is that then those whole policies and procedures that you back everything up with were sort of forgotten about. So I think using Chris as an example and others that are in the room next week, the lawyer that's come in, Dot's fantastic. She lobbies central government all the time. I think the more of us that collectively, it's not an us and them, the more of us a collective that sort of project that view to government, to thought leadership, etc., and that sort of thing in terms of where it needs to go, because we can't keep being beaten because morale, we talked about recruitment earlier today as well. These are all massive challenges. If we keep going that way, it's only going one direction, and we need to make sure that You know, frankly, I think we do a bloody good job overall. You know, I don't think we pat ourselves on the back too much. I think it was the reference before to subcontractors. You know, I've done it myself when I was managing. You know, they do 50 jobs and I ring them up about the one they've messed up on, but we forget the other 50. You know, we do it with operatives. Well, you know, he had muddy boots. He had muddy boots because he'd done this, this, and this, and this, and look at all the other great things he did. So I think collectively as a sector, we've got a really good story to tell. We provide a massive sort of community benefit to so many people. We do an amazing amount of social value, as has been mentioned multiple times today. I think we need to be better advocates of ourselves and use the people that we know in higher ups to sort of do that. But yeah, I was councillor all over that as well.
Okay, brilliant. Is that it? Okay, can we show a sign of appreciation for Chris? Thank you. Okay, well, that wraps it up today. So thanks, everyone, for attending. I've really enjoyed it. I think there's some brilliant speakers again today. Theme really run through everybody, and it's always great when another speaker mentions the speaker before as well, because it all resonates, which is exactly what we're trying to do. So thank you for that. All these events are recorded, so we will get those on the website and on YouTube as well. So that'll be in the coming weeks when Matt sends them. I'll get them loaded on. If you could, at the end, leave your lanyards on the desk there, please, if you could. Recycle. It's always good to do that, isn't it? Yeah, and I just thank you again for attending, and just wish you a safe journey home. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.